Hello friends, now I'm going to discuss mystic literature, for which I have chosen some of the notable writers of mystic literature. The content of my lecture is divided into 3 sections. In the first section, I'll give you a brief overview of the background. In the second section, I'll deal with some select writers of mystic literature. In the concluding section, I would focus on the appreciation of mystic literature. Let me now talk about the background. We all know that the element of mysticism had always been there in the writings of Plotinus and in the Vedic scriptures as well. Later, in the 13th and the 14th centuries, Rumi and Kabir spoke of their mystic realization in the form of poetry. But the term was not known to anyone. It was often confused with religious literature. People were not really aware of the subtle differences between religion and mysticism. Mysticism, as we know, deals with the themes of love, cosmic consciousness, and oneness. It has nothing to do with the rites, customs, and the instruction of the priest or godman. It is individualistic. For the present lecture, I would talk about Rumi, Kabir, Walt Whitman, British Romantic poets, Rabindranath Tagore, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, and Jiddu Krishnamurti. Now, I move on to the second section of my lecture dealing with some select writers of mystic literature. I will begin with Maulana Rumi. Rumi was a Sufi mystic poet of the 13th century. He was born in 1207 and died in 1273. His major works include Makhtib, Diwan-e-Shams, and Masnavi. Masnavi contains 27,000 lines of poetry. It is written in couplet. Makhtib is a collection of letters. A Sufi mystic always believes in a spiritual union with God, and the ecstatic state of union is known as Fana. A Sufi mystic achieves this mystical state through music and dance. Let me now quote an example from Rumi's poetry dealing with the themes of mystic quest and non-dualism. Quote, "O friend, you are invisible within me. I dreamt, I saw you in wondrous forms. Where has the moon gone? Where those eyes of last night?" Unquote. Here, we see that the poet is searching for the Lord or the inner self, who has been personalized as his friend. Let me now move on to discuss Kabir. He was born in 1450 and died in 1518. Kabir's poems are epigrammatic in nature, dealing with the themes of love, cosmic consciousness, and union with the divine. Time and again, he speaks of sublimating our ego to realize the Lord in us, and therefore he says, quote, "When all love of I and mine is dead, then the work of the Lord is done." Unquote. The sublimation of ego also helps us to transcend ourselves from gross emotions like jealousy, hatred, and all sorts of meanness. The I of our egoistic self stops us from integrating with every aspect of this cosmos. Next, I will discuss the poetry of the British Romantic poets. The poetry of Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats are primarily characterized by the elements of imagination, love for nature, pantheism, and simplicity of expression. All the British Romantic poets are pantheists or nature mystics. The doctrine of pantheism refers to the image of anima in every living and non-living entities of this earth. Romantic poets express the same sentiment in the form of poetry. nature is a living entity for them, as we see in Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. In Shelley's poetry, we find a mystic quest for an ideal world. His skylark soars high above in search of it. Unlike Wordsworth and Shelley, Keats is a worshipper of beauty. Beauty to him is synonymous with truth. His mystic quest continues for the image of divine beauty. Here we notice that the note of mysticism in British Romantic poetry is slightly different from the mystic seers of the past like Rumi and Kabir. They are primarily pantheists, as this world is a manifestation of divinity to them. They do not talk of union with the Lord. They are rather keen on realizing the presence of the mighty spirit in the cosmos. That is why Wordsworth says in Tintern Abbey, quote, "And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense of sublime," unquote. Now I'll move on to Walt Whitman. He was popularly known as the poet of the mass. The poems of Whitman project his mystic adventure beyond the mundane plane of consciousness. His all-embracing love for humanity culminates into a feeling of cosmic consciousness, which is a key image of mystic poetry. A mystic, as we all know, connects himself with the cosmos, and at the same time, he becomes a part of it. That is why Whitman says in The Leaves of Grass, quote, "In all people I see myself," unquote. This is a mystic's unifying vision and love for all. Now, I'll talk about Rabindranath Tagore. His poetry especially takes us on a mystical quest for the infinite amidst the finite. Like Whitman, he too embraces the humanity with love, and this love for humanity culminates into a quest for the divine. Therefore, in the second poem of Gitanjali, he says, quote, "All that is harsh and dissonant in my life melts into one sweet harmony. I forget myself and call thee friend, who are my Lord," unquote. The poet persona is eager to merge with the divine in sweet harmony. Next, I'll focus on Swami Vivekananda's contribution in the area of mystic literature. As a mystic, he always preached the doctrines of non-dualism. Like Kabir, Tagore, and Whitman, he too identifies himself with everything of this earth. The feeling of cosmic consciousness is a doting image among all the mystics. A mystic cannot help but loving all. Therefore, he says in a poem entitled The Song of the Free, quote, "I cannot hate, I cannot shun myself from me. I can but love," unquote. Therefore, Evelyn Underhill says that mystics never think of fleeing the world pervaded by joy, love, and beauty. This feeling of all-embracing love helps him to look inward in search of the self in us, which ultimately culminates into a union with the divine. Let me now move on to discuss Sri Aurobindo. He is both a mystic poet and a philosopher who has discussed in details the planes of human consciousness after Freud. He has also indicated under which condition the mystic emotion works. According to him, the mystic poetry is the poetry of vision and intuition. It is not an intellectual construction. It originates from a mystic's vision of inner truth. This is a very personal experience of the mystics. A mystic is able to experience that when his or her psychic being becomes receptive. The Upanishads terms it as Purusha Antaratma. The psychic part of us is the portion of the divine in all living beings. Iqbal refers to it as Ruh. But the element of psychic being in us is not active in all. It becomes active when we have a strong feeling of empathy for all. Awakening of the psychic being leads to the heightening, widening and deepening of our consciousness. Now I'll talk about Jiddu Krishnamurti. In fact, he is the last writer of our discussion. He was primarily an experiential thinker and a seer of life as well. He had delivered lectures over the span of 90 years on themes like nature and essence of living. In an essay entitled The Years of Awakening, he says, quote, "I have seen the light. I have touched compassion, which heals all sorrow and suffering. It is not for myself, but for the world. The fountain of truth has been revealed to me. I have drunk the fountain of joy and eternal beauty." Unquote. These lines describe the mystic awakening of a seeker in an inspired moment. William James says, quote, "Certain aspects of nature seem to have a peculiar power of awakening such mystical moods." Unquote. Before concluding my lecture, I would like to opine that mystic literature has to be appreciated through our intuitive perception. It is a special way of seeing and feeling things. Intellectual mind is not supposed to intervene in this context. If the intellectual mind intervenes, the text will be colored by the rational mind by bringing in allusions and references, as it happens in the poetry of T.S. Eliot. We have to remain open to embrace every aspect of this cosmos to appreciate mysticism. Thank you.